I'm Lester Abinger, the FRPA's legislative representative, and as usual and always with me is Steve Bosquet, the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Tampa Bay Times. We're some 7 or 8 days since the end of the legislative session. The legislature has adopted a budget, severe cuts to funding for environmental programs and park development, almost $500 million in cuts to the Medicaid program. Now it's up to the legislature and the governor to decide what happens next. Steve, can you help us with what some of the scenarios might be?
Sure. Rick Scott is going to get the budget at some point in the near future, not sure when. That's a game within a game because this has to be resolved by June 30th. But by every indication we're seeing, Rick Scott is going to make surgical but massive cuts to projects that individual legislators want to bring home. He might even veto the entire $24 billion budget silo for public schools. That's K through 12.
Just for context purposes, the entire budget is $82.4 billion, so $24 billion is a huge
Right. To that point, and we haven't seen this happen since Lawton Childs 25 years ago, but he has the legal right to veto the entire budget. What does that mean? That means that the legislature would have to come back into session before June 30th and in effect do the budget all over again to Rick Scott's liking. However, the legislature, by a 2/3 vote in both chambers, can override that veto, and it looks like they've got the votes to do that, which would be an utter humiliation of this governor if that were to happen.
Right.
And that's a risk I don't think he wants to take. So.
Interesting. So what options does the governor have right now?
Well, I think his options are to say, look, I've had even Democrats say this, look, put yourself in Rick Scott's shoes. I didn't ask for very much. He asked for 3 things, basically. He asked for $200 million for that dike at the Herbert Hoover Dam and dike in Lake
Desperately needed, a public safety measure.
And he asked for $100 million each for Visit Florida and Enterprise Florida, which are very important to him.
Right.
And the legislature said basically no to all 3. And so he said, so why should I lift a finger to help you get your stuff to the finish line? So he's going to be vetoing a lot of projects, partly because he's going to describe it as wasteful and inefficient, and partly is as old as politics itself. If you don't show any respect for what I want, why should I show any respect for what you want?
Right.
That's all it is.
He also wanted over $600 million in tax cuts and ended up with just a little bit over $100 million.
I'm not sure it's that high, but it's in that range. But that's a good point. So these relationships between this governor and this legislature, and they're all Republicans, have been deteriorating for some time, but it is at a historically low point right now.
How interesting. Yeah. So we really, are you inclined to speculate as to how long it'll be before we know how this all plays out, or are we on hold until the legislature transmits the budget to the governor?
Based on experience, based on knowledge of how the process works, and based on the temperament of the people we're dealing with here, I don't think that anyone wants to risk this government shutdown, which is what you would have. If we get to July 1st and there's no budget in effect, keep in mind Richard Corcoran wanted to do a continuation budget, but nobody else wants to do that. That is, just keep things the way they are for every program.
Right.
Something has to happen very quickly, and by no later than about the 1st or 2nd week of June. You've got to get the legislature back in here in a special session, if needed, if he vetoes the education part of the budget. If all Rick Scott does is veto member projects, people like me are going to ask, with all due respect, what was the whole point of all these trips around the state, calling out legislators and saying, I'm going to respond. All your priorities got trashed, and you didn't respond in kind. You didn't back up the threat with action. You've got to back up the threat with real decisive action. He's got an opportunity to do that.
Right.
So,
and just as a little added twist for our members, how does that all play out politically in terms of the Senate election and the governor's election in 2018?
Well, a great point, and I think that's a big factor here because I think if Rick Scott he could look like he's moving a little bit to the left by vetoing the entire K-12 education budget. He's now standing with school superintendents and school boards and standing for the principle of you didn't put enough money into public schools. Who's going to argue against that? It's hard to be on the other side of that equation. Number two, He's been doing this for months anyway. He talks very disparagingly about those politicians in Tallahassee. So he's running against the legislature the way Harry Truman used to run against the do-nothing Congress. Same idea.
Well, as they say, Steve, may you live in interesting times. We will be back perhaps with another report after July 1st when we have more answers to the questions that we've posed and to the scenarios we've raised this morning.